during war, pre and post migration. This was inspired, many of you who may or may not know this, by this constant reference to Surah Al-Sharah and the few ayat that are in that surah that specifically speak to this concept of inna ma'al usri yusra, verily with hardship comes ease, and the guidance of striving in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, another caveat here is I don't assume that when I'm working with people who identify as Muslims, they would make references of these types. So I don't come in with the assumption that everyone will want to use Islamic verses or ayat in their spiritual or religious practice. But this was, something I maintained a curious, decentered, not knowing stance about when I was working with this particular family. And I did ask if there was anything specific that she leaned towards in terms of her health and wellness in difficult times. And this was something that she talked about.
And I think that last piece is really important, especially in the context of dominant folks taking up Islamic ideas. This kind of paper, we kind of grappled with that ethically a little bit, about we don't subscribe to this idea that cultural competence approaches, or that you need to you learn about people's perspectives as as a check mark. And I think I think what Siham's saying is really important there, that this not knowing stance allows that perspective. So we looked at 5 different specific narrative tools, and we'll talk about each of them. Double listening, reauthoring conversations, testimonials, and remembering conversations are powerful tools in the narrative practitioner's toolbox, and we looked to see how they could be used, or rather how Siham uses them in anti-colonial spiritual social work practice.
The narrative practice of reauthoring conversations really helps people to move away from the external problem-saturated story and discover alternative storylines. For narrative practitioners committed to this anti-colonial spiritual practice, reauthoring conversations centered on uncovering the racist and colonial problem-saturated stories which devalue people's religious beliefs, spiritual beliefs, and overall identity is really important. This means attention is drawn to the values, the strengths, and the experiences of people, and away from the practitioner knowledge and expertise.
So this notion of double-storied testimony is really useful in working with children and families with experiences of displacement and resettlement. For narrative practitioners who take up spirituality and religion in practice, this may involve testimonials of faith and belief. Double-storied testimonies are stories offered up by people we work with who may be sharing a traumatic life event that requires a practitioner not only to bear witness, but to help assist in capturing a person's response to it. Listening to testimonies of faith and belief, bearing witness to stories of acts of atrocities, exploring change through the socio-political analysis and the use of religious and spiritual inner reflection, honor local knowledge and can be used as an anti-colonial act of resistance. For example, Sabrine's testimonials of faith included not only conversations of hardship and ease, but of her spiritual and religious truths. Sabrine proclaimed all power belongs to God, and that there were certain things out of her control. Siham encouraged her to share pictures and videos, both personal and those from the media, as part of Sabrine's testimonial. And Sabrine would discuss these in global contexts. And this is really particularly important because often in other approaches, the global contexts are acknowledged but kind of disappeared. This is an active way of bringing this forward. Inviting testimony in sessions allowed Siham to support and affirm Sabrine's insider truths and support a global citizenship that is often taken up by people who have endured war. And in this way, critical reflections of Sabrine's life was used as an intervention to support her testimony agency and understanding her own life story.
Narrative practitioners also use a tool called Remembering Conversations, through which people are asked to remember loved ones or significant historical figures or people that, even religious and spiritual figures. So remembering conversations is something that's very useful in supporting a person to recall loved ones or discuss the positive contributions they have made in their own lives and how they've actually influenced their identity. So once a person speaks about their values, narrative practitioners who take on a spirituality and religion may help them to seek and speak about the special relationship impacted their lives through this lens. I want to just add here that Sabrine actually made reference to Sitna Hajar during a lot of our conversations and about how she endured, you know, as a woman. She almost referred to her as this feminist woman who was just taking care of her child, standing up to male, you know, the Arab tribes that came and you know approached her, and she often made reference to Sitna Hajar, which was really wonderful.
So opportunities exist within narrative practice to address inequitable and intersectional relations of oppression and seek to support those marginalized by racism, colonialism, slavery, and Orientalism. But these opportunities cannot be actualized unless social workers and other practitioners understand and actively advance an intersectional anti-colonial analysis to their practice. Validation of group and individual spiritual practice honors the experience of people who have experienced colonization and displacement and privileges their localized knowledge. And in this way, our approach can be used to resist and uncover contemporary colonial impositions. Such an approach also provides a means for reclaiming Indigenous knowledge and for uncovering how particular stories are tied to colonial history and domination. It also informs reconceptualizing spirituality and religion in terms of well-being and self-care, and for allowing other knowledge to be brought forth and honored.
We thank you all for having us today. We hope that you enjoyed our presentation. I really do look forward to listening to the remainder of the presentations today and welcome any questions that you may have about our particular work. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for that. That was amazing. Okay, so now we're going to start our next speaker. Okay, so the next topic is the paradox of integration of American Muslims during the Trump era, and this will be by Zehra Kaya. Zehra M. Kaya is a PhD candidate in counseling psychology at State University of New York at Buffalo. She's currently a doctoral psychology fellow at University of Illinois. Previously, she was working at Roswell Park Cancer Institute as an advanced practitioner clinician. She also holds a master's degree in mental health counseling and wellness from New York University. Her clinical and research interests include diversity, multicultural issues, eating, body image concerns, death and dying, risk assessment, crisis management, and discrimination experiences of marginalized groups. And she is also now starting her, or has started her clinical postdoctoral residency at Cornell University. So whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I think my bio is actually from last year. It's not updated. Probably you didn't get the updated one.
No, I didn't.
Not
I
very
wasn't
important,
sure.
But I graduated, thankfully. So
You graduated.
So yeah, I'm a postdoc right now. So anyway, I will share my screen. Can anyone see my screen? I mean, okay, is it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So I will be talking about a research which actually created some kind of really interesting results based on the relationship between acculturation and religious discrimination that Muslim Americans actually perceived, especially in the Trump era. This is part of my dissertation. So as a quick overview, I will have some introduction, like I will be talking about the relevance of this topic to the Muslim population. I will be speaking about the methods that I used, and conclusion and clinical implications, of course, will be discussed too. So the research question that I ask in order to like start this study, what relations exist among perceived religious discrimination and acculturation in Muslim Americans during the Trump era? So why Trump era? So as we all know, Trump era was very unique and difficult era for many marginalized and minority communities, like in terms of like oppression, prejudice, discrimination, and including actually like Muslim Americans. So what does perceived religious discrimination mean? It refers to individual understanding or perception of religious discrimination. So it is like slightly different term than religious discrimination, because not everyone perceive, maybe like two Muslim people may experience the similar amount of religious discrimination, but they may not perceive the similar amount. So, and as we all also know, like there are minorities among the minorities, so it depends on different like identities, like marginalization, and some people may actually experience it more. So acculturation is another term which is important for my research. So it means a multidimensional process that includes one's orientation to both one's ethnic culture and the larger society, not necessarily actual like assimilation, but also integration of like someone's like native culture with the host culture. Acculturative stress is directly actually like and indirectly harmful to minority mental health and well-being. So it is also used in my research. So what does it mean? As a summary, like stress is a reaction to challenging factors individuals experience while trying to integrate and adapt to the dominant culture. So as a growing minority group in the United States, so Muslim Americans are quite diverse. So although 42% of like US Muslims were born in the United States, but there is no single racial or ethnic group actually within the American Muslim community. So there are actually, this group consists of like individuals who are immigrant, who immigrated to the United States, descendants of immigrants, converts to Islam, and descendants of converts. So they vary in degree of acculturation. So, according to some of the research, there are some differences between them and, perceiving the religious discrimination, such as foreign-born Muslims are less likely than US-born Muslims to say that media coverage of Muslims is unfair, and being a Muslim in America has become more difficult in recent years. Or also, I think like US-born Muslims are more likely to perceive Trump as an unfriendly to Muslim Americans than their foreign-born counterparts. But classical acculturation theories actually like tell us the contrary, the opposite. It suggests that like when individuals were more integrated into the host culture, so they are supposed to experience less discrimination. They are supposed to like integrate it better, and the society are supposed to give like less reaction to that. The methods, like inclusion and exclusion criteria was on the left. So I will not be actually like going through every details because of the time. But the participants actually like they were like 302 Muslim Americans recruited for the study. And I collected the data between like February and June, like 2019. And it is important to highlight that that time was still Trump era. So the Trump was president in that moment. And simple linear regression was utilized to predict perceived religious discrimination based on acculturation. And the results actually quite striking and like very significant. And they showed that like participants who were more acculturated reported acculturated reported like higher levels of perceived religious discrimination. So like these findings like contradicts older acculturation theories, which suggest that, for example, like the individuals are more integrated to the like host culture. When they become like more fluent in language, they become actually like start pursuing higher education, they start like receiving like higher income. So they are supposed to be experience like discrimination less, but it actually like didn't prove in my study. So contrary to those theories, more recent studies actually argue that more integrated and acculturated individuals are more likely to perceive and report discrimination, which is, I mean, this is a relatively newer term called like integration paradox. So specifically, this results actually like similar to two of the studies, although the studies about Muslim Americans acculturation and religious, perceived religious discrimination are very limited. So two of them actually also like similar to like integration, similarly like prove the integration paradox in Muslim American community. So what we can conclude from this like result? So the finding can be explained in like several ways. So since fully grasping the nuances of the language like requires a high level of cultural fluency, so it can be defined like being able to speak English well and being born in the country. Like Muslim Americans who are more acculturated in the United States may be more attuned to microaggressions and discrimination they experience. So as a recent immigrant, I could actually like relate to that experience. So like in the beginning, I actually immigrated to this country like 10 years ago with a very limited English skills. So in the beginning of like my journey in the United States, I was probably like way more, welcoming and actually like forgiving, not understanding so many actually like things like microaggressions and the cultural context. I wasn't that much familiar. But when the time actually like goes by, and when also I become more fluent and like more educated, so then I become like more attuned to like catching those like subtle or maybe like implicit like biases and oppressions. So another explanation could be like Muslim Americans who are less acculturated may not attribute this to, these discrimination acts to their Muslim identity. They may think like it's because of like their immigrant status. So they receive like those kind of like perception. But there was actually an interesting study which was done like in 2010, and they compared actually like acculturation process and perceived religious discrimination between actually like Muslim Middle Eastern and Muslim actually like Christian immigrants, and they find actually the Muslim participants when they actually like have higher acculturation, they actually reported like higher level of like perceived religious discrimination, while their Christian counterparts actually like when they acculturated more, they actually like report less discrimination. So definitely like Muslim identity is also like marginalized here more than like Christian one. So that may actually like have an impact on that. The third explanation may be like if individuals who were less acculturated were not born in the United States and not fluent in English, they may not be familiar with issues of the American democracy, like social justice, equity, equality, and multiculturalism in the United States. They may not able to go to like American education system. So for that reason, they more actually like they may not maybe necessarily like experience, but definitely like perceive less discrimination because of actually like the context that they are in or they are coming from. So another explanation could be like as a clinician, I have to say, definitely like acknowledging and vocalizing discrimination is a privilege. So especially like among minority groups, because not everyone who experiences discrimination has a safe and supportive environment where they can actually like share those experiences. I mean, not even actually like with themselves. Sometimes actually that would be easier to just like ignore. It could be easier to deny those kind of experiences rather than like acknowledging it if you don't have any like power to change it. For example, if expressing discrimination increases like distress, and if they need to continually like return to the same environment, which actually creates like high stress, like workplace, school, or like some kind of like meeting. So they may choose to deny deny that happens rather than actually like feeling uncomfortable and afraid all the time. So therefore, more educated, more economically well-off, and like acculturated individuals may able to be more vocal about their discrimination experiences compared to like those with like less privileged position. So the last one might be also like explained as like Muslim Americans who have like who are holding actually like higher positions may feel more responsible to advocate for their community, because most of the time, so they may be the like people who are actually representing the whole entire like religion sometimes in the position that they are in. So that could motivate them to just like speak up more and advocate for like the community. So what are the clinical implications? The clinical implication we can actually like derive from the study. Clinicians definitely like should keep in mind that their Muslim clients might not recognize internalized oppression they experience due to their Muslim identity and engage with self-blaming attitudes and beliefs if it's clinician, and then it's clinicians actually like responsibility to highlight those institutional and societal oppression when it's appropriate. So the second one would be like clinicians also should be aware of the fact that more integrated, acculturated Muslim Americans are more likely to perceive, not experience, perceive and recognize discrimination. However, it is also critical to know that not reporting or perceiving discrimination doesn't mean these clients are immune to ongoing anti-Muslim discrimination or hatred. So they may be using denial as a coping mechanism. So it is important to like, include like these determinants while doing like conceptualization in the clinical work. The third one, marginalized individuals may compare themselves. Third one is like being familiar with the term of relative deprivation. So what does it mean? In a simple explanation, marginalized individuals may compare themselves with other individuals and groups in terms of opportunities, which can lead to feeling disadvantaged in comparison to like others due to like awareness of unfairness about like being given opportunities, which is called relative deprivation. So feeling relative deprivation can be expected to be higher in more integrated marginalized individuals. So because they may be more likely to compare themselves with the majority of members if they perceive like similar kind of education, similar kind of experiences and CV, so they expect more to be in the similar level. So therefore, clinicians actually need to be considered that the higher educated and more integrated Muslim Americans may express like higher distress with respect to discrimination. And definitely the last thing that we as clinicians also always like keep in mind and always actually like put in the context while doing any kind of actual work, intervention, conceptualization, or even like outreach. intersectionality of identities. So we need to understand intersectionality of Muslim clients and avoid making assumptions based on our limited or maybe like unlimited, like Muslim, knowledge about the Muslim community. So they, and definitely like empower the clients, explore their identities, and also like highlighting them, like not only, they are not only like one type of like being, there are actually like multiple identities in them, and it's actually like very unique for person to person, and definitely like using more like humanistic approach to like understanding each of them without actually like making assumption. So this is the end of my presentation. So I was under the impression of I will have like 15 minutes. So I adjusted as a 15 minutes. So this is my email address. I would be very welcome to receive any kind of comments, question, or recommendation or criticism. So, and also like connect with the people who are interested to do some like collaboration about the research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. So our next two speakers, we have Jordan and Miriam today from the Muslim Justice League. The Muslim Justice League's mission is to organize and advocate for communities whose rights are threatened under the national security state in the United States. Jordan is a queer Muslim South Asian community organizer, artist, and educator. In their role as community organizer at Muslim Justice League, they serve as the membership coordinator, lead education and youth justice initiatives, and organize with local communities. And in addition to their work as an organizer, Jordan also co-founded and choreographed for Power Play, a performance art and contemporary dance company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They have also worked in both Winchester and Cambridge public schools as a special education paraprofessional working with children on the autism spectrum. Jordan is currently enrolled in an MSW and Ph.D. dual degree program at Boston University, where they are focused on macro social work practice, gerontology, and public policy. And then we also have Miriam Ware, who is a third-year neuroscience and behavior undergraduate student at Mount Holyoke College with an interest in neuropsychology, mental health awareness, and social justice. Her work has included assisting with planning, organizing, and facilitating health justice team meetings. And she hopes to obtain a PhD in clinical psychology to ultimately become a clinical neuropsychologist studying the neural basis of prejudice and discrimination. And you can go ahead and start whenever you guys are ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just make sure that I am fully presenting. Okay. All right, thank you so much for having us. I'm so excited to be here and talk about Islamophobia in the context of like health policy, essentially, and national security framework. So I'm going to just launch and get us started in talking about countering violent extremism. So for those of you who don't know, countering violent extremism, or CVE, is a federal anti-terrorism framework that claims to prevent people from becoming terrorists by mobilizing community resources. CVE uses facially neutral language like extremism and radicalization to make it very clear without being explicit that this is about Muslims. Guided by flawed scientific studies on the radicalization process that position communities as co-producers of national security, CVE efforts range from policing social media content to subjecting individuals to psychotherapy. The majority of these programs rely on community members to identify and report individuals perceived to be vulnerable to or in the process of radicalizing. As we will see, these programs are informed by disproven research and burden communities with policing their own children as terrorists. CVE launched in 2014 under the Obama administration, and since then it's proliferated and into even its current form now to be rebranded as Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. Its derivatives have increasingly focused on mental health care, including a shift within CVE programs from the idea of a multidisciplinary team to a threat assessment team. And we can even think in the context of that language, how, you know, the frame is shifting to be more on like the threat of violent extremism. And you know, especially with who it's targeting, this is essentially saying that they're often seeing Muslims as a threat that needs to be assessed. So like I said, the language is facially neutral with terms like extremism and radicalization, but those have always disproportionately focused on Muslim, immigrant, and otherwise marginalized communities, Black communities, even queer and trans communities. And it's all founded on the debunked theory of radicalization that conflates political speech and beliefs with a propensity toward violence. So typically when we would lead a workshop with MJL, everyone's like monitors, or if we were in person, people would just raise their hands. But I'm just gonna read out some of these statements that are typically used to identify someone who might be at risk for radicalization. And you can reflect for yourself on which of these might apply to you. So I'm gonna focus on specifically things like having psychological issues, being unemployed, having a sporadic work history, having less education, a lower social economic status, failing to achieve one's aspirations, having trouble in romantic relationships, having trouble in platonic relationships, having been abused as an adult, or being distant from one's family. So as you can see, these are very broad terms that I think many of us can relate to. And thinking about these terms as being used to identify folks who are at risk of radicalization or violent extremism, even from the DHS framework, is proven not to be true, essentially. So they even say in their own FAQ sheet, having one or more risk factors does not mean an individual will engage in targeted violence or terrorism. So then that begs the question, why are we using these risk factors as a means of identifying folks who are at risk of violent extremism? Let me shift over. So again, as you can imagine from what I've already said, CVE has a disproportionate focus and impact on Muslims, Black and brown folks, immigrants, and individuals who are seen as politically suspect in some way. In effect, CVE deputizes community leaders, teachers, and service providers to look for constitutionally protected behavior such as worship and affiliation as somehow pre-criminal. Even when folks propose that these programs might help to root out white supremacist violence, many of whom are calling for the expansion of these programs, we have to look at who these programs are already targeting. In theory, the capacity for these programs to address white supremacy might exist. However, we cannot expect a program to counter white supremacy from within a system that has historically been shaped by it. So it's not equal opportunity, as it often is sort of billed to be. And you know, the ways that it sort of uses the community and like helping professionals to police itself can really chill access to social services and healthcare. It also can police people who are trying to express their political power as activists and sort of disempower them from demanding their own civil rights and what is just. So recently at Muslim Justice League, we have a health justice team that's been studying a local multidisciplinary team that includes law enforcement, FBI, mental health practitioners, and faith leaders who are working under a CVE framework. And we found that information by doing public records requests. That's a common tool that we use in order to identify something that's as nebulous as CVE. So in this case, an individual was singled out as posing a threat and treated in a way that stigmatized them, left their voice and agency out of the conversation, and undermined their civil liberties and autonomy. It's just one of many examples of the way that presumably well-meaning community members can contribute to the harm and stigma directed at an individual, especially individuals suffering from various forms of mental illness. So we can see in this case, it started as a genuine concern among some community members, like they got some troubling voicemails. They were concerned that this community member might be some sort of threat. And then it sort of quickly escalated to the point that a lot of people were violating this individual's privacy and essentially criminalizing their mental illness. And you can look at other cases that have happened since CVE framework really proliferated, like Mahin Khan in Arizona, in which, so Mahin was, I think, 15 when he first had some sort of interaction with something at school that led to the FBI to contact Mahin and basically intervene. So they intervened in Mahin's life from when he was 15, but family members of his will say that he, he has the mindset of a child. He clearly suffers from severe mental illness. He doesn't really have the amount of agency to really be any amount of threat. However, the FBI continued to intervene. And then as soon as he turned 18, he was incarcerated and entrapped. And really what was happening is his mental illness was being criminalized. His Muslimness was being criminalized. And that's sort of the really challenging and disturbing sort of context of a lot of these CVE, of what CVE looks like in practice. So I'll pass it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Jordan. So PREVENT is a UK counterterrorism program that has been around 14 years longer than the United States CVE program and has had some opposition due to its targeting of Muslim and Asian populations. There is data collected from the BMJ journal showing that Muslims are 8 times more likely than non-Muslims to be reported to PREVENT, and Asians were referred 4 times as often as non-Asians. Also, it has been reported that from April 2015 to March 2016, out of the 7,631 people referred to British law enforcement, 65% were for Islamist extremists versus 10% for right-wing extremism. In 2016, the United Nations Special Rapporteur voiced concerns over the PREVENT program, highlighting that it is stigmatizing and alienating segments of the population. The United Nations may eventually start voicing their concerns on America's CVE program because there seems to be a similar approach being taken that also targets Muslim populations. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide shows the viewpoints of people who support countering violent extremism and how they also have concerns about the overall direction CVE is heading. In one paper, an interdisciplinary team in Boston focuses on addressing questions regarding the multidisciplinary team called Community Connect that is tackling violent radicalization. Although the team claims to work with youth populations of all ethnic backgrounds, there are many points within the paper that show that their multidisciplinary program was specifically focused on ethnic and religious minority populations. An example of this is a quote straight from the paper that states, "Some CCT members expressed concern that sharing information would lead to youth being arrested rather than getting the support they needed." Next slide, please. Another paper addressing countering violent extremism as public health policy and practice states that there is no precedent for the US attorneys giving blanket immunity to criminal prosecution, including for mental health professionals. This means that there is no clear protection for mental health professionals who may be sued due to confidentiality violations. Without this clarity, why should mental health professionals risk their well-being and the trust of patients to screen for vague definition of violent extremism? A 2014 paper by Davies, Elb, Howell, and McHines found that through an analysis of government policies and mental health scholarship, there is no clinical procedure that can detect risk factors for violent extremism. So the mental health effects of CVE on Muslims is worrying. The BMJ journal reports that PREVENT referrals can damage people's physical and mental health due to the lack of medical confidentiality with Muslims and the fear of being linked to terrorism. This is a really unfortunate side effect of CVE because now some Muslims are afraid to seek out mental health professionals for their mental health issues, which may lead to many mental health issues being untreated and left unnoticed. This fear of being surveilled leads to depression, emotional repression, anxiety, and PTSD. A 2014 research paper reports that 1/5 of American Muslims in a community sample experienced government surveillance that caused anxiety, leading to an avoidance of public settings and avoiding outwardly showing that they were Muslim, like avoiding interacting with other Muslims or wearing religious apparel such as the hijab or thobe in public settings, for example. Next slide, thank you. Unfortunately, there has not been concrete evidence or research conducted that shows the validity or effectiveness of CVE. Even though the National Institute of Health stage model of psychosocial intervention development requires researchers to test actions that produce behavioral changes in clinical trials to demonstrate effectiveness before it becomes widely implemented in the public health system. This hasn't happened for CVE. So moving forward, focusing more on addressing the health needs of Muslim communities without any link to CVE may be more effective and impactful. Government organizations such as the National Institute of Health, Substance Abuse, and Mental Health Services Administration and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality could work with the Muslim community on addressing their mental health needs. Along with this initiative, community-based participatory research could aggregate policymakers and researchers with families and mental health professionals to solve problems that Muslim communities prioritize. Otherwise, communities may continue to experience disenfranchisement. Mental health professionals may risk prosecution for possessing sensitive information, and policymakers may lose credibility. Now I will pass it back to Jordan to transition into concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mariam. So, as we think about the next steps, I mean, one thing that Mariam just mentioned is talking about community-based participatory research. So at MJL, we actually have a new community-based participatory research project that we're working on in understanding how Muslims in the Boston area in Massachusetts have experienced government surveillance and policing. So if you are in the Boston area, please look to our information online to join us in that. So I want to just share, after actually I'm done sharing my screen, I'll share this link, but we have a Health Justice Team toolkit where if you want to learn more about CVE and healthcare, you can look through more articles and information about how you can identify CVE that might be happening in spaces that you're in and how to sort of combat those systems. Another important thing is to not advocate for anti-terrorism measures. So this is something that we hear a lot with folks talking about increasing domestic terrorism legislation. We see with all the research we've done on CVE and CVE-like programs that any expansion of those terms and the use of those terms really just serves to target, police, and criminalize Muslims, brown and black folks, and other immigrant folks. So although, we want to really name and like live with the real threat of white supremacist violence, identifying it as terrorism can ultimately serve to harm our communities more than it really will do to root out white supremacy. The other thing is to stay informed. So find out if your local masjid, university, or healthcare center is receiving CVE grants. Anyone can submit a public record request. That's something that we do a lot at MJL. And we even sometimes will either host trainings or point people in the direction of trainings to learn how to do that. And also locate alternatives to policing for mental health crises in your area that truly center community well-being. And then, obviously stay tuned with organizations like us here at Muslim Justice League or organizations like Vigilant Love, who really talk about the expansion of these programs and their impacts on our communities. I just want to leave with this really amazing quote from a member of our health justice team who worked on our case study. So we acknowledge the ways many mainstream mental health delivery structures have historically and continue to function as extensions of the medical industrial complex, the surveillance state, of colonization, of control, and of oppression that cause and reinforce harm unto members of already marginalized communities. The methods in which mental health care is extended to every individual has substantial power in both potentially dangerous and liberating ways. A paradigm of mental health care that is rooted in the values of justice, self-determination, and sustained equitable and dignified relationships is pivotal within and outside of Muslim communities today. A collaborative effort to work toward better understanding how we can align our collective care practices as closely to these values as possible is an act of both reclamation and liberation-rooted transformation. So I wanted to leave us with those words that I feel like are really powerful and sum up a lot of what's underneath our countering violent extremism. And just want to leave this up. So please do feel free to reach out to me by email. You can also connect to us on Twitter at Muslim Justice and on Instagram at Muslim Justice League. And then as soon as I stop sharing my screen, I'll send a link to the CVE and healthcare toolkit that's on our website. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much for both of you being here. And we have some questions in the chat, so I'm going to pull that up right now. Okay, so first we have a comment, I guess, if you guys want to speak on that. So it says, as an educator who works in a very high Muslim population, one of the reasons to explain the integration paradox is that you feel more comfortable to challenge and speak up against microaggressions. As the presenter just mentioned, it's not that acts of Islamophobia are not happening or unnoticed in the earlier years of being in the country. It's that one does not know how or who to report it to. If any of you have anything to say to that.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Fatima, for that contribution. So we can overlook, like, just like seeing maybe if they are not reporting, they are not experiencing. So it's not necessarily they are not experiencing. It's probably they don't know how to, maybe they don't even actually like have word for it to just like say like something wrong. So yeah, that's important to actually like, especially like mental health practitioners, to know that it's happening. And I work, I mean, like in last couple of years in a college counseling centers, and mostly my experience with like international students, like in the beginning of like their entrance of the United States, they may have in that phase, which we also sometimes call like honeymoon phase, everything seems actually so rosy, so they may overlook those kind of experiences, or they could just like be more forgiven compared to like if you have been like experiencing this like for 5 years or like 6 years, if you keep actually like seeing the results of those experiences, so then you may probably feel fatigue and you may probably will start giving more different reactions than that just like dismissing or actually forgiving. So thank you.
Thank you. And then there's another question for you. Are there racial and class differences among the two groups? Have you considered that racism, including anti-Black racism, may show up differently in second and third generations?
So I think Dr. Shaheen asked that question. I think it's a very like critical and important question. So thank you for asking it. So it came up, of course, like in my study. So unfortunately, like I couldn't reach a quite actually like multiracial population in my study. It's actually probably, I think if I'm remembering correctly, 48% of the participants are white. And only, I think like 8% is multiracial and 4% are actually Black. So, and I didn't use, the acculturation scale that I used was like a continuous scale. So it's not actually like group, it's more actually like focused on like who are people who are more acculturated, like express like more discrimination. But it's, yes, I think definitely, especially like in this day and age, like it is important, and sometimes like it's not inseparable. So definitely that's why it's important to just highlight the intersectionality, and also the minority of the minorities. For example, a Black Muslim woman, it's like triply discriminated compared to a European Muslim woman maybe. Mm-hmm. So I mean, like in the future studies that would be definitely like included, and in order to like reach out, and especially when I really like had hard time like collecting the data. So I think 1,000 of people like clicked my survey, but only like 300 like actually finished. And a couple of people that I reach out to me later on and asked to remove their answer, because it was actually during the Trump era, and they were afraid of like if they have the data safety, although like it is very ethical and it's actually go through all the like ethical like approval process, but still they ask, well, I'm in the green card process, I don't want my answer to just like cause losing my green card, or like I don't want to just like maybe like someone will go after it. So definitely that cultural mistrust may impact their answers too. So we need to come up with the different ways of like reaching out those communities and the people who are more marginalized and definitely experience like more discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really good answer.
Mm-hmm.
For Miriam and Jordan, there's a question for you. There has been some good anti-stigma work within racialized migrant and Muslim communities of this mental health, but this trend is disturbing as it will set this work back, and that our elders might be correct in being suspicious of mental health practitioners in this regard. Has this happened in the UK-US setting?
Yeah, so I mean, this is I think this is one of our biggest concerns with something like the expansion of the CVE and TVTP framework is the distrust that it places between our communities and the needed mental health care. And it is happening in both the UK and the United States. So PREVENT started long before CVE. So PREVENT in the UK started long before CVE here. And we can sort of see it as a window into our future if CVE and TVTP continue to expand. And I think, you know, when I think about how do we maintain that trust between our mental health care providers and our communities, I think it really takes making sure that our mental health care providers are aware of these frameworks and that they're not taking these grants. Because, you know, if they're taking these grants, then it's challenging for folks to really trust that they can access the care they need without having any of their data reported to things like the FBI. Although, you know, then there's also the challenge of like, oftentimes mental health care is underfunded. So where do we find the balance of finding the funding without contributing to the surveillance state?
And well, I've been to a couple of talks with the the Vigilant Love folks, and it is really hard because it's hard to actually, you don't even know necessarily you're in that. And I think that the idea about funding, you think you're dodging a bullet, you're getting the funding, but you're really doing this other work. But the schema are so clear, and they force you to think in that way, even when you make the application. So we may think we're being really intelligent. Sorry, I shouldn't have spoken up without asking. But I think that we think that we're being really intelligent, but my research on funding processes really means that we even start to think in those lenses, even if you're critical or you know, working towards that. It's really disturbing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think that's something that we see even in the case study that we're currently doing, is that folks who are participating in this aren't necessarily like out to get us. Oftentimes it's our own community members, you know, so I think it really points to the like larger systemic, like the white supremacist system that we're trying to navigate within often ends up sort of like harnessing us and like our community to work against ourselves. And you see that not only with Muslims and CVE, but in all sorts of other areas of, you know, life in the United States and all other countries who are impacted by white supremacy this extensively. So yeah, it is really challenging. I don't think that we always necessarily have all the answers other than to try to raise awareness. And the more that we know as a community, the more we can protect ourselves and the more we can advocate for care within our community for each other. But it is a really, I mean, there are some days working this job and absorbing some of this information is just really disheartening. And because I, you know, as a Muslim who seeks mental health care, like I want to know that I'm able to receive that care without being surveilled.
I wanted to add one more point. I'll give you an example of something that Sobia, you probably heard this example many times, around this double-edged sword that occurs when you're dealing with or hoping to fund particular programs for your community. And then the governmentality sort of apparatus that forces you to use a particular type of language. I remember a few years ago when, well, you know, in Canada, our governments have shifted quite a bit in the last few years, thankfully. But at some point, you could get funding for honor-related violence like that in London and in Ontario specifically. So it also works it sort of works against you, or it reinforces this essentialization of Muslims as being this particular way, right? And women being treated in this particular way. And then, you know, some of the time what you end up doing is you apply for the funding, you get the grant, and you tweak things when you get the money. And it feels terrible. It's just such a horrible thing to do. But then you end up justifying it. And to your point, Sobia, you really internalize these systems, and you end up becoming part of the problem. So I thank you for this, both presenters. This is such an excellent topic. And we've got some issues here in Canada as well. Our anti-terrorism bill is pretty ridiculous. So thanks.
It's very interesting, the conversation you all are having. It reminds me of day one, the other day, one of the panels that I was moderating. I wrote down this quote. Somebody said, patriarchy and misogyny is inherently European, and it's not inherently Islamic. And so she kind of brought that point up, and it makes me, you know, kind of wonder and think about how much that and like colonialism has impacted the way we view ourselves in the institution.
So we have Zehra's hands up. So I think you could go, Zehra. I mean, excuse my pronunciation.
Yes, hi there, everybody. Zehra here, Assalamu alaikum. Very nice, all the Siham, Zehra, everyone's work. I forget the CVE presenter here, their name, but I'm so glad that we are doing work that I have always thought of in the context of Islamic psychology, also recognizing that there are truths to our existence, whether we are immigrants or biracial couples or biracial families, especially children. I work in Rhode Island with Muslim youth from Boston suburbs and also in Providence. But the idea is that there is so much to unpack in terms of people recognizing that there are layers of identities, right? So as you said and talked about, the terms like agency and intersectionality has become part and parcel of our work that we do. My understanding is, and maybe I can draw from your work in my clinical practice as well as inspire you to look at the fact that youth could be confused at many levels developmentally and relationally within their families. Women have their own issues, men have their own issues, but at the time when typically we have dual income families or families from immigrant and refugee backgrounds who are trying to gain a foothold in this country, this is our country, yes, we want to make sure that we don't raise our children thinking they're not part of America. They are American citizens. At the same time, they are twice removed from their roots, whether it is their faith or their culture, or the parents' culture or the grandparents' culture. So in that context, the Islamophobia becomes even more problematic, a reality that they have to deal with, because they don't have the wherewithal to have deep roots. For instance, right now it is Ramadan, around, as it happens every year, mashallah, Easter and Passover, the three monolithic religions that are out there. So we want to make sure the elementary age children and the teenagers and the young adults who are going to college, when they are on campuses, right now that's not the case for college students because of pandemic, but pre-pandemic, I have often had clients, parents reaching out to me, and their biggest fear was that I'm worried that kids are going to make fun of my children or my young adult children because they are not going to be able to participate in dorm-related fun activities. And we all know what those fun activities are. They could be positive and Islamic center-oriented or skiing or educational, or they could be perhaps leading kids to risky behaviors or intimacy relationships between genders. So the idea is we have some internal work to do within our communities. And then on top of it, we want to have a parallel dialogue going on externally so that the Islamophobic sentiment is dispelled. We are encouraging our fellow citizens and our provider colleagues in non-Muslim backgrounds to recognize that this is a vulnerable situation for many of the youth. And if somebody is coming to you, for instance, from a place of, I don't want my daughter or son to be drinking or smoking, and I want your help in parenting or family therapy because they are conflicting and they're not understanding discipline, oftentimes, both for some Muslim therapists and also for some non-Muslim therapists, I frequently hear that, Zehra, perhaps there are 3 or 4 people in Mass and Rhode Island area who do therapy, and we are worried our kids are going to get into some sort of a law legal issue because they will be underage and they'll be in the influence of their peers, and they'll be drinking and smoking and all of that. So there are many issues to unpack here, because it's not just Islamophobia, it's not just developmental rebellion, it's all of it in the mix. And our goal can be to not only empower youth, but also empower the parents who do mean well for their children. And integration then becomes the big topic. That, you know, I know that in our field, through research and through clinical practice, we are also doing a lot of education work, both for the youth and for the families and parents. So how do we align everything so that we don't, A, pass judgment on anybody, and B, don't impose anything on anyone. At the same time, be brave about educating people about the consequences of whatever choices and decisions they might want to still go ahead with. And that's what I wanted to say. I'll follow up on all three of your work. Thank you so much for being great colleagues and presenters here. Thank you. Allah Hafiz. Be well.
So thank you. I think like you did a great contribution, and as a summary of like all of our actual like work that we presented here. So one thing maybe I could say, based on my like clinical experience, I think like Islamophobia is not only targeting like practicing Muslim. So I think it's enough, like even you look like Muslim, or like you have a Muslim name, or like you are Middle Eastern, but not even Muslim. So it's not actually like only practicing Muslim issue, it's more actually a social justice issue. If we actually like switch the paradigm and looking from that perspective, rather than actually like owning it as like a Muslim actually like responsibility to like cope with it, it's more actually a broad perspective. And it's actually like, as I said, like social justice and human rights issue. So mostly, I mean, youth who have some kind of like connection with their roots and their culture and community, they have more protective factors than actually like who may not have those resources and community actually like places. So I think our role should be making those like community like more accessible and definitely like inclusive for the people who are not actually doing the work, practicing or not practicing, or like doing the Islam in the same way that we do. So I think that would be the like only way that if we like get together, then we could actually like fight with Islamophobia together. So because Islamophobia doesn't mean only related with Islam, it's even actually related with xenophobia too.
I agree. I think one more thing that I'd like to add very quickly in the interest of time, just be mindful of it, is that I notice a lot of the times that young people, they themselves, like a lot of surveys are out there. I was actually talking to a colleague and I had said, maybe we need to come up with an Islamic code of ethics for those practitioners who really truly want to work from that perspective, and recognize that the spiritual science concepts that are needed in IP can be applied to these, because the idea of, I have a youth development background of many years and coaching and mentoring programs set up in New York and in Rhode Island. And I noticed that youth need a purpose, especially. And so if they're not confident about their identity, then they're not going to be able to excel in all of the different spaces that they might be. It will be their community, their mosque, their integrated groups of peers in their school and in their academics, and out in the community. Really, even it is something as simple as the community street where people are walking together, but some Muslim children or young adults are hesitant to go out and walk with everybody else. Or they're just looking for the kind of groups that they are looking for are not accessible where they live. Perhaps like, they are involved in some activity which can be strengths-based and building their sense of self-esteem and self-image, but they don't have access to it because parents have other concerns that, oh, if we let our kids go here and there, they're going to end up with some sort of a trouble because the trust is not there within the larger mainstream society's peer activities, right? So oftentimes parents don't let their children go for, now again in the pandemic it has changed, but I'm using it as an example, that for study abroad at a younger age, whereas the students who might be of a similar age group who are not Muslims, they might be easily or readily supported by their parents to go and do study abroad, even when they are getting scholarships or grants to do that. What can we do to educate parents that recognize that there is a distinction to be made between educational activities and pursuits? And then you can have the trust in your child to be able to go out and spend 3 weeks during the summer in a educational activity and not be worried and discouraged by the fact that your child will be singled out merely because he or she happens to be Muslim, or that your greater fear is that they are going to end up in some peer influence which will take them away from their Islamic core values. So I find that to be a big dilemma where parents, especially if they are conservative, they run into that sort of a mindset. And then that discourages the young person who could be otherwise quite capable to be able to avail those opportunities that they could avail otherwise. So maybe we need positive surveys that help recognize that there are positive examples as well, and not just these fear-based understandings of their existence in an integrative framework.
Sorry, I'd like to just sort of chime in on that. Aside from doing this particular chapter, the intro mentioned, and the work that Sobia and I do, we work from a very staunch anti-racist and anti-colonial lens. And so I want to just kind of clarify, this is always interesting when you're situated within certain hubs and panel discussions. I'd like to make it very clear that our particular approach is not an Islamic approach or rooted in any particular Islamic framework. And I'll tell you why I'm trying to draw some attention to that specifically. And that is because in the way that we conceptualize the term spirituality, religion, or even practice and wellness is not situated within particular faith. I've used this framework with youth who are Muslim and LGBTQ. I've used this framework with youth who are Wiccan, who are witches, and who practice that faith, who are often otherized. So this particular approach, again, I want to make it really clear, it doesn't necessarily center an Islamic value or framework. And I think that even when we introduce those frameworks, it's very dangerous. The problem, we don't only have a problem with Islamophobia, but we have a problem with oppression within our community. Right? So there's this danger that occurs when we start to talk about frameworks or using, working with youth in this particular way. I grew up in the city of Chicago. I grew up in a very urban city in the city of Chicago. It was not the wealthiest neighborhood. And the Muslim youth that I grew up with and the families that were struggling with some very different issues. And not really the ones that were previously mentioned. So I really have a very hard time very uncomfortable even having this conversation with broad brush statements and absolutes, right? This is constantly shifting and constantly changing. Another point I would like to mention is this term intersectionality. Again, Sobia and I have discussed this very, very frequently, the appropriation of the term intersectionality. Intersectionality comes from critical race theory. You can't have a conversation about intersectionality as a way to map and situate bodies. This is not a mapping, procedure, right? And so it needs to also come with the assumption that racism is endemic. It makes no logic. It's contextual. It's constantly shifting and changing, and it's not applicable outside of the Muslim community. It starts actually within your Muslim community, right? So it's not about saying, okay, the Black Muslim female wearing the hijab is having a harder time than the white passing Arab pale-faced woman who can change her name to Sam instead of Siham and pretend like she's Spanish or something and nobody will say anything to her, right? It's not about having those conversations. It's about talking about actionable responses. How do we in our communities internalize whiteness, perpetuate whiteness? How do we in our communities perpetuate heteronormativity and cisgendered positions? How do we do that? And how do we do it substantively? So when we talk about emancipation and social justice, I really feel like we kind of pick and choose where we want to kind of focus our issues. So I really want to also just to clarify that. Sobia, I don't know if you want to kind of chime in on the chapter in our conceptual framework and maybe piggyback off of some of the things that I said.
I think you said it really well. I also want to say that some of the ways in which adultism and sanism work in our communities really are really interrelated, and I think that the kind of we've internalized a lot of these ideas, and I think Zehra's project actually really kind of highlighted that for me, where we've internalized some of the very racist ideas about cultural clashes and generational clashes that we actually and we participate in those conversations in ways which deny the multiplicity of Muslims' way of being Muslim, and I think that's why we were really careful, even writing this paper, even pursuing this paper from this perspective. I think we hesitated. I think, even though we think there's something to offer in the literature about doing direct practice within Muslim communities, we hesitated because we know that that's going to be taken up as the ease and hardship surah. It's going to become concretized. It's going to become like hard and oh, this is what Muslims really want. And so we were kind of responsible. And then Muslim folks also will take this up and say, oh yes, that's what it is. So I think that this idea of really paying attention to what people are saying, and I'm sure many of us who are in direct practice are doing that already. So I'm not criticizing anybody here. I'm just saying that we do take a not knowing stance, and I think that's what is really important. And I think I don't know, Zehra, you said something like that Islamophobia is a social justice issue and not an issue of Islamic identity. And I think that's really that's very wise as well, in my opinion. And I think that we all participate that, especially when we're in direct practice, because, in responding to Islamophobia and hatred towards the other, which is xenophobia, I think we get scared a lot of times, and we want to reproduce this notion of, unity, or, we get scared, and I don't blame us. Collectively, I think that it makes sense in a very hostile environment, but I think that in my opinion, it's the hostile environment that we have to be fighting against, not the diversity within our own communities. I don't know if that added what you were thinking, but there you go.
I would love to jump in just really quickly with what you're saying with that, because I feel like I can relate to this both like in my role at Muslim Justice League as a community organizer, but also as a queer, genderqueer Muslim. Like, I feel like there's often, sometimes folks with identities like mine might be perceived as somehow like doing Islam wrong, or being, that youth who's like sort of countered their faith, or like somehow, like, I don't know how to fully clarify it because it's also resonating personally for me. But I think it taps into that idea that for us as a Muslim community to exist and survive in the United States, that we have to operate in this like we have nothing to hide mentality and prove how like clean slate, perfect we fit into roles. And I think that also, that's something that happens even within the CVE framework, is that because we want to prove that we have nothing to hide, we're really willing to collaborate with things like law enforcement just to prove like, look, we have nothing to hide. Well, why in the first place do we have to undergo that level of surveillance? And why, do we sort of perpetuate that within our community and against each other when, ultimately we all are going to be our own version of Muslim, like that. Like we live in a multiplicity of identities and overlaps. And I really appreciate what you're saying about intersectionality as not just being like, let's play the oppression Olympics and see who is the most oppressed. Like that's never been the point. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say is, I think we put a lot of pressure sometimes on youth to perform Muslimness in Islam in a certain way. And I think sometimes out of a desire to protect them from what we perceive as threats from the state, from our country, from Islamophobic, xenophobic violence. But ultimately, I think that there's another way to do it. There's another way that allows for us to liberate ourselves and support each other without sort of having to perform a certain type of Muslim identity.
I mean, the idea of model minority especially those of us who are from Asian communities or Arab communities, and I'm maybe not going to speak so much for the Arab community, I can speak for my own community. There's certain communities that we do fit into the model minority myths, and other communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities that are activist communities, they don't fit into those model minorities. So I think this is really racialized as well, and I think we've got to remember that, and we feed into that. And I think that that's how we uphold, I mean, we took that out of our slides, but you know, it's how we uphold, you know, racism and colonialism in ways. And I think that this CVE piece especially is really fearful, is really scary, because we want to fit into this idea. It's classed, it's raced, it's definitely gendered, you know, and I think it's really important for us to work against that in any ways we can.
I'll actually respond to the question here quickly. I don't know, do we have time for me to respond to this question quickly, Akila?
Sure, you can go quickly, but this will be the last. And if you guys want to drop your emails down.
Actually, it's very interesting. You said something, you talked about model minority, Sobia, Jordan. You both talked about different, I think, mechanisms within like anti-terrorism bills, governmentality. I could talk to you all day long about psychology and social work and scientific and modernist paradigms that we've internalized and we continue to perpetuate within our own work. I will make a comment about the Islamic framework. My question is, what Islamic framework are you referring to? Are you referring to the Salafi Islamic framework? I have some issues with the Salafi Islamic framework. When you say Islamic framework, we're 2 billion Muslims. You know, alhamdulillah, our Islam and our deen, it offers us the opportunity around the art of deduction and interpretation. So when we're developing this Islamic framework, who's included and who's not included in this framework? That's the danger. The danger is in the ambiguity, and the danger is in the patriarchy that is already embedded within the Islamic world, right? As a feminist Muslim woman, I have a huge problem with Islamic frameworks, or who's going to be developing them is my question. I think, you know, I'm a Muslim woman. I believe in Islam. I am a practicing Muslim. But again, when you're applying Islamic frameworks to something that's so serious and so close to home for folks, I think there is quite a bit of danger that comes with that. I hope that answered your question.
And as a last sentence, I want to think, like, Siham's like point about, like, we need to start those integration from the Muslim community, because we are also like experiencing and like, I mean, also like doing people discrimination in the community as well.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, all of you guys, and also Zehra for your contribution too. It was like interesting to hear everyone's opinions and to open up for discussion. I mean, we have to have, you know, collective criticism to be able to understand everyone's perspective and see all the work that you guys are doing. So thank you so much. So Akila, I guess we're done for this session.
Yep, inshallah, there will be a 15-minute break, and then we will see you guys in the last panel before the closing ceremony. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.